Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program, Omar Nadi, who is Director Supplier Product Management at Elemica. And today we're going to talk about streamlining and automating the procure-to-pay process. Now, this is a process that many companies are focusing on, especially those that have to deal and manage with hundreds, if not thousands, of suppliers, and high volumes of purchase orders, shipments, and invoices. So what are the challenges that companies are facing as they try to streamline and automate the procure-to-pay process? And what's the role of technology in helping to facilitate this whole thing? Well, those are some of the questions we're going to address in today's episode. And it's great to have Omar with us on the program to share his insights and advice on the topic. So Omar, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Adrian. Looking forward to our conversation.
So, Omar, we've had many of your colleagues there at Elemica on Talking Logistics over the years, and this is your first time. So I'm always curious before we dive into the topic, how and why people get involved in this industry to begin with. So why don't you briefly tell us a little bit about your career path and kind of what your role is there at Elemica?
Sure. I took a more direct route than a lot of my colleagues to get here involved in supply chain. Went to engineering college. I briefly had a run in patent law when I graduated. I thought I wanted to be an IP attorney, worked for a corporate law firm, realized that wasn't where my passions lay, and had an opportunity to come work for a company called Rubber Network, which was focused on digitizing and optimizing the inbound supply chain for the tire and rubber industry. So I started there around 15 years ago. We were acquired by Elemica in 2009, and I stayed on. I've been working with Elemica since then, got into the product management side of things, and now run our supplier product management suite, very much still focused on the same things that I was back then, which are, how do we solve the problems of the inbound supply chain and deliver products that create value for our customers.
Yeah, no, great background there, and I think it's perfect. Kind of leading into the topic at hand here. Like I mentioned, in my opening remarks, the procure-to-pay process is something that many companies are focusing on today, and ultimately it depends on the ability for buyers and suppliers to be able to communicate and collaborate effectively with each other. I mean, how automated or streamlined are these interactions today? And, kind of what are the main challenges or hurdles in the way?
Sure. And I think I should preface my response by saying, there are really kind of two streams within procurement, right? There's the indirect material side, which is very much focused on controlling the activities that lead up to placing a purchase order, right? So the requisitioning and the workflow, making sure that you're using the right supplier at the right price and controlling spend that way. It's very much a focus on controlling spend. Then there's direct material procurement, which is very much focused on what you talk about around getting suppliers onto the network, interacting with those suppliers, making sure that when you send an order to that supplier that you get information back from them, letting you know if they are going to deliver that on time and in full, getting shipment information when it ships so that you can really control your working capital, because that's the difference between the two predominantly, is that one's much more focused on working capital control and one's focused on spend control. Within kind of the supplier networks that I know of, with the customers that we work with and just in the market in general, in the worst case scenario, companies are really just kind of firing purchase orders effectively into a black hole, right? Where they're not getting information back. They don't know if that order has been confirmed. They don't know whether it's going to be delivered on time or in full. And in the real worst case scenarios, they don't know that there's a potential issue with that order until the day of delivery. The next kind of tier up from that in automation or in successful kind of programs here, the companies that maybe 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, connected a handful of their top suppliers on via EDI connection, either managing that with their in-house IT, doing point-to-point, or going through a van, and then maybe adding another handful of suppliers on a custom portal they built that's part of their ERP system. The next kind of group that have really kind of pushed that envelope and been much more successful are ones that have utilized digital networks or business networks like Elemica to really leverage one IT investment and get a much broader kind of success rate with connecting their partners, whether they be suppliers or logistics providers or customers, some other entity that they interact with as part of their operations. And those companies, the most successful ones, the real leaders there have digitized north of 90% of their supply base, and are interacting with their suppliers, knowing well in advance if there's going to be an issue with a particular order that they've placed, and even pushing the envelope further, integrating logistics providers into that process, because logistics obviously is very important in the direct material supply chain. When you're focused on working capital, you're focused on keeping production up, and indirects, materials, office supplies, you're placing an order for office supplies. If it's late, a laptop, cleaning service, that's not going to, shut down a production line. That's not going to cost you $250,000 an hour to take that offline. So that it's much more critical to connect suppliers in a direct material network and get that data back into your system. And even the ones that are really on the leading edge are also doing more collaborative replenishment approaches, whether that's a vendor managed inventory kind of approach or forecast collaboration, but something where they're sending signals upstream in the supply chain, setting production plans, setting inventory, so that their suppliers can better plan, and that kind of benefits everyone that's participating in the system, right? And that's kind of the breadth of how I see companies starting, going from the worst to the best, and how they're kind of automating their supplier networks.
Yeah, that's a great way to kind of break it up in terms of the laggards and the leaders, if you will. I mean, I think my perspective on this has been that historically a lot of companies kind of focused on the 80-20 rule, right? They focused on 20% of their suppliers that accounted for 80% of their transactions. But in this environment where companies are trying to make smarter decisions faster, they're looking to customer requirements becoming more demanding, so on and so forth. That 80-20 rule really doesn't work anymore, right? So kind of getting to that long tail of the supply chain in terms of that remaining 80% of suppliers and trading partners, and how do you bring them on board and be able to communicate and collaborate with them more effectively, I think has been kind of a key area or challenge for a lot of companies. So when you said some of the folks that are kind of leveraging some of these the platforms like your platform, getting up to 95%, that's pretty leading class, right?
Yeah, that's pretty significant. To get there it's a very long ongoing challenge, right? So these are companies that have a very mature kind of approach to how they want to build these networks, and they've incorporated this into how they do sourcing, from top to bottom within that organization. They've made sure that this is, that they've kind of sent the message out that this is how we do business. This is how we need to do business. This is an expectation we have of our supply base, a service they need to offer us. So yeah, they really have worked very hard to achieve those kind of numbers, for sure.
And obviously, I mean, this leads to my next question. Obviously, technology has played a role here as well. I mean, I think in the past, some of the challenges were that, EDI was the only game in town, if you will. And really that was really only applicable to the very large companies who can afford it and had the resources to do EDI and maintain those connections and so forth. I mean, fast forward to today, I mean, what new technologies or capabilities are available today to overcome, some of these historical challenges and barriers?
Sure. So some of those problems, right? So you touched on a few of them. There's others in the sense that, are your suppliers even capable of doing EDI? When you look at your broad supply base, especially in direct materials, you've got a very broad geography of suppliers, very different sizes of these companies and IT budgets. Can they do EDI? Then if they can, does it warrant applying their resources to do that for you? Right. So you run into the issue of what is the IT capability of the supplier. Then you get into adoption and change management. If they can't do, IT or an EDI connection, what are the alternatives you can offer them to participate? And traditionally that's been a portal, right, which has its own kind of pros and cons. And if a supplier is getting 20 different customers coming to them asking them to connect to 20 different portals, obviously that supplier, may have to hire more people just to manage all the portals, and there's change management, training, configuration, adding them on there, training a backup, all of that comes into play. And then just the cost structure of certain networks can be a real challenge. If all of the burden's kind of placed on the supplier to pay for all of this, that can be a real struggle, right? And that's an advantage that, to your point about larger companies, they can subsidize some of those costs. They can go to their supplier network and say, we'll pay for you to get on the network. We'll pay for you to build out that EDI connection, or we'll subsidize it or pay for you to get on to a web portal and things like that. And obviously that gives them a little bit of an advantage in building a network and making that more palatable for their suppliers to participate. When it comes to technology, to answer your question around technology, traditionally these are the only two channels that have been offered to suppliers. You connect via EDI, or you connect, via a portal. Those are the two ways for you as a supplier to support your customer's digitization initiative, right? What's really exciting now is that we're introducing, we're seeing the rise of a third channel. And I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek because it's not a new channel. It's really a leveraging and an augmentation of an existing channel, that being email. So, email is something that we're all accustomed to. It's something that we all use on a daily basis to conduct both our personal and professional lives, right? So, and in many cases, it's what these suppliers are used to using already. This is how they get a majority of their orders today with their clients, right? So it's kind of the channel that's existing and been out there. We just haven't been able to do anything with it to make it, a part of a digitization initiative. So what's happening now is that email is really being empowered to do so much more. And the way that works is, when an order comes into a network, you can convert that order into different electronic formats, right? And one of those is email. You can send that to the user, get an order. You would get an order just as you would today, only now instead of hitting reply to send that back, you hit a button within that email, put your, I can deliver this amount on this date. And instead of hitting send, when you hit send on, on this kind of version of an email, what we call in our network quick link email, it's instead of that just going back as an email, now that gets converted back into an electronic signal to your customer, and it goes back into their ERP system as a order confirmation. And to that buyer, you're a supplier that's now on the network, right? You're a supplier that has been effectively digitized, and you haven't had to do anything, right? It really addresses those challenges we talked about. There's no upfront IT barriers, right? There's no cost or technology that you have to be able to adopt other than email. There's no portal. You don't have to, go build out a bunch of different, to go access a bunch of different portals. You don't have to train backups. You don't have to remember username and passwords. You don't have to worry about that degradation of portal kind of onboardings that exists where there's turnover within companies. Adrian leaves the company. Does someone else know how to use that portal? Do they remember how to go and access that portal, right? Instead, when those emails are going into that customer service inbox, if there's turnover, somebody else is still manning that customer service inbox and able to interact with those emails that are coming in, right? So you don't have that degradation and ongoing expense of monitoring and keeping your suppliers current on a web application. So it's a really cool technology that's really enabling companies to build networks much faster and at a much more reasonable cost. And it's empowering suppliers too, right? Because suppliers want to offer this as a service. They want to do this for their customers, but they want to do it where the return on investment makes sense for them as well, right? They want a win-win. And this has really kind of enabled that. And it's enabled smaller and medium-sized suppliers to compete with the suppliers that are much larger, have much bigger IT budgets, right? Because now I can participate, I can offer that as a service just as well as a very large, multi-billion-dollar supplier can offer that as a service. and it's done in a way that it makes it easy for me to offer that, right? And it also helps buyers that are small or mid-market buyers in the sense that they didn't have the budget to subsidize all these connections and help really build that network. And now they can do that very cheaply, very easily, it scales very easily. So it's really leveled the playing field for both mid and small buyers and mid and small suppliers, that they now have a means to do that. It's really, to your point, just real quickly on the long tail, right? There was never a business case for connecting those long tail suppliers, right? If we're talking about a supplier that has 1 or 2 orders a month, is it really warranted to build an EDI connection? Is it really warranted for them to have the expense of using a portal, and especially once or twice a month, trying to remember how to use one of those different portals? Whereas now the cost, when the cost is zero to add a new supplier to the network, now all of those suppliers are fair game. That's all something that you want to add to your network. That's all something that's part of the scope of your digitization program with a technology like this available.
Yeah, and all great points. And I think, to me, it's, historically, when I would talk to folks and they would say, to your point about, connecting to that long tail, it's like, gosh, if I try to connect, I've got thousands of suppliers, right? If I try to connect with all of them via EDI, for example, it will literally take me like 300 years, to do that. By the time you set up the systems and do the mapping and testing and everything else, it would take, weeks with every customer, with every supplier, and we just don't have the resources or the time, to do it. And to your point, in some cases it's just not worth it, because you're not, just doing a handful of transactions a year, right? But I think what's happening today is that, even if it's just a few transactions a year, you still want that data, in a digital form and within your systems, because it is part of your broader, supply chain. And I think that, the fact that you can leverage a tool like email, that I think many of us have this love-hate relationship with email. And in some cases, or a lot of cases, it's a non-productivity tool. In this case, it's being able to convert through more modern technology, being able to leverage email in a much more productive way, and in a way that integrates effectively with, a platform and with the enterprise systems that companies have, to get away from the, manual inputting of information, or, be able to do this in a much more, this integration in a much more scalable and cost-effective way, as you described. So I think you're right. I think, EDI has its place, and, I think that it's not going to go away anytime soon. But, you also have APIs that are a part of the mix right now. You still have portals, that still makes sense in certain cases, but being able to have this new tool, to your point, which is not really new, it's leveraging email that's been around forever, but leveraging it in a more modern way is, in some ways a game changer, in my opinion, to really get to that long tail and really drive the digitalization of end-to-end supply chains. So ultimately, how do you quantify or measure, the benefits? What's the business case at the end of the day for streamlining and automating, your P2P process?
Sure. So that business case usually starts with talking about kind of reducing administrative burdens, right? Administrative overhead, data entry, things like that, right? So if you can get an order confirmed through a system, or a ship notice put into a system, nobody at that organization has to then go key that into their ERP. They don't have to go key the ship notice in, or the quality information in, so they can release the goods into their production. They don't have to key invoices in. So it starts with that kind of manual effort, data entry effort. And that matters because, the procurement organizations I talk to have real talent shortages and issues around that, right? So if you can free up capacity, free up talent to develop so that they're doing things other than data entry, and now you can develop them to do something, more value added in your company, that's really important. And we're talking about significant, amount of time that's spent when we're looking at hundreds of thousands of orders, coming in every year for a particular organization. The other value case exists around kind of the latency of that data. So, invoicing today still for the most part comes in as a paper copy in snail mail. So some of that comes in via email. Some of that comes in via, a network, but a lot of it is still paper, right? And you can't control you can't optimize your working capital or take advantage of things like payment term discounts, right? So if a supplier offers you 210 net 30, right, where you can take people off if you pay within 10 days. A lot of the times you're waiting for that invoice to get there. It's getting into a mailroom. It's going to somebody's desk. Somebody has to key it in. By the time that invoice exists in your ERP system, that 10 days is passed, right? So you can't make that decision around what you would rather do and pay them early or hold on to that money yourself. So that's a big component of kind of the savings of automation. And those things that I just talked about really apply to both indirects and directs. Direct materials. So direct materials, obviously, it's going to be more important around having the ship notice and things like that in there. But really, in the world of directs, when we talk about working capital control, this is the first layer of visibility into your network, right? And the way that you manage lack of visibility in your network is really one of three ways. One, you throw people at it, and you have a bunch of people checking, did that order get confirmed? Is it going to be delivered on time? Did it get shipped? Can I call the carrier? Constantly making sure that their raw materials are going to be there to keep their production lines running, right? The second way you manage that, if you don't have a digital network, is through inventory. So you just keep an excessive amount of safety stock, 10, 15 days of safety stock on hand, manage those bumps so that when you don't know that an order isn't going to be, you don't know that there's an issue with an order till the day of delivery, you can manage that by keeping excessive, inventory, and that's how you maintain your service levels, right? And the third way is really transportation costs. So if you don't have that visibility and you don't have, the inventory level to manage it, what you do is you air freight things, right? So, you have whole crisis teams that are dedicated to an order didn't get here. How can we shuffle, materials around from these plants that are around there and then get an order to that plant and kind of move it around, or do we need to air freight it? And those costs are dramatic, right? For air freighting something, you're talking, close to $100,000 for a given cargo container of 22,000 kilograms, for example, versus that coming over on the ocean being significantly cheaper, right? So those are the three ways that companies typically manage it. So, you as a company, you've got the administrative benefits, you've got the benefits for kind of invoice discounts and managing your cash flow that way. But also, inventory. And we're talking about millions and millions of dollars in inventory that you're probably keeping on hand because you don't know what's going to happen in your supply chain. And that's really the business case that we see.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think those three buckets, the labor savings and labor productivity. I mean, that has a significant impact. And then you've got the inventory aspect and the transportation aspects. I think when you really start looking at this whole P2P process, you see the ripple effects that it has on these other supply chain, processes and functions and cost buckets, in terms of the overall, value proposition. Can you share? I mean, you kind of gave some high level examples there. Maybe can you expand a little bit? Maybe share a customer example of P2P automation, streamlining in action.
Sure. We have customers that we've worked with that we know have, taken days and days of inventory, saved millions of dollars that way. We know customers that have talked to us about, every order every confirmation they don't have to key in is 10 minutes. Every ship notice is 10 minutes. Every invoice is 15 minutes. So they talk, half an hour, let's say half an hour for every order over 100,000 orders. That's 50,000 hours of effort. That's 25 FTEs. That they talk about. A really great example that always jumps to mind, that always kind of touches on kind of all three of these is, generally plants are incentivized to keep production running, right? That is their major thing. Do not let any production line get shut down. So they don't care so much about working capital. But one organization that we worked with, looked at their inventory and they said, we're keeping an excessive amount of inventory. We know that we are. So they kind of had a program where they were pushing this down onto their plants. We've got to get inventory levels down a certain amount. And the plants complied with that, and they got it down. And in the first quarter of that year, where that program was initiated, the result was that because this company didn't have visibility into what was happening within their network, that they had millions and millions of dollars of expedited freight costs. So they got the inventory down, but the result was that they had to spend a lot of money, millions of dollars on air freight to manage the hiccups in the supply chain because they didn't see them coming. Because if you know 90 days in advance when you place an order, or 30 days in advance, depending on kind of what the lead time is in your supply chain for that particular supplier, if you know within 24 hours that they can't deliver it on time and in full, your mitigation costs are next to nothing, right? If you know when that boat was supposed to get on the water and that container didn't make the vessel, your mitigation costs have gone up, but they're still not extreme. If you don't know until the day that container is supposed to get there that there's a big problem, or that it's supposed to get to the port, near your plant, then your costs are obviously very extreme. So this company working with us, was able to digitize all these suppliers, these critical raw material suppliers. And ultimately what they achieved is they saved millions of dollars in expedited freight. They met their inventory objectives and keeping their inventory safety stocks at a level, a much more reasonable level, and saved millions of dollars that way. And they talked to us about how, administrative burden or overhead wasn't really one of their goals, but they were able to grow as a company without having to hire new resources, and that was because of the digitization initiative that they had done. So they kind of hit on all three and it was a really great story working with them.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example of how it impacts those three buckets of inventory, labor, and and transportation, and significant dollar figures here. And obviously the bigger the company you are, the greater the impact, especially the more suppliers and the more orders you're processing and so forth. I mean, that has a greater impact. We're running short on time here, so I'm just going to get to my kind of last couple of questions here. I mean, we talked about kind of this, the I'll call it smart email, that's kind of helped companies become more digital with their suppliers and trading partners. Are there any new or other technologies or innovations on the horizon that are going to continue to push the envelope forward here?
Sure. So there's a lot of buzzwords out right now, blockchain being one of them, IoT, social. I think blockchain, there's definitely, a lot of interest in blockchain right now. Whether, how we're going to apply that, I think is still a little up in the air. I think that's a little bit too far out almost to really kind of understand what the impact is. Is it going to be, an improved messaging platform? Is it going to be how we do finance in the future? Is it going to be, chain of custody that's important in the pharmaceutical industry and agricultural industry? The things that I see kind of on the immediate horizon, and that are already being applied in some cases are IoT, components of IoT, right? So being able to, smart pallets where you're tracking an individual pallet, knowing what temperatures it was exposed to, knowing what shock level it was exposed to, humidity, especially when we're talking about raw materials, those are all very important. So now, as before where you would have to go connect different logistics partners, maybe now you can go to a data aggregator, build out an API, and get GPS signals, off of boats, off of containers, off of trucks, and apply that to your supply chain and know at a much more granular level what's happening, and not even rely necessarily on partners, but having multiple sources that provide that shipment information, what's happening. I don't always have to get it perfectly timely information from my supplier. I also have these other sources of data that are coming in and providing info. And from a social perspective, and also kind of talk about big data, there's also these feeds coming in where people are making sense of, risk events and things, aggregating all these different news events so that, the world's getting to a point, in the very near future where you as a buyer placing an order know, is there an issue at that port? Is there a labor strike at that port? Did an explosion occur at the hazardous materials section of that port? then you could track, did my container get loaded on the vessel? Was it rerouted? You know exactly where that container is via GPS. And you're adding all of that into kind of the tracking that you're doing of your supply. And that's the really cool stuff that I see kind of that we're on the cusp of kind of really putting that whole big picture together and adding all those APIs and other kind of service providers data in there to give you, real fine-tuned control of your supply chain.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that's an area that, when it comes to social, when it comes to IoT, real-time freight visibility, which is, hot topic, these days. Those are all things I see as well as, ultimately going to be playing a role, and a bigger role, moving forward. And, blockchain too, I think that's the big question mark. I mean, I think they're, depending on the type of industry and depending on the supply chain, we'll probably have a role here as well. But, the one thing that's always sure is that, this industry continues to evolve and continues to innovate. So, we'll continue to see that happening in the years ahead. So, as a way to wrap up then, I mean, what questions, should companies ask themselves, to assess whether they're kind of a leader or a laggard when it comes to, their P2P process?
Sure. So the way I think that, so I don't want to give a bunch of metrics that are, you can go to different consulting sites that have, that look at this and say this, you want to look at procurement as a percentage of spend, how much cost is procurement, things like that. I think the one big driver that everything else kind of falls into place behind is, what percentage of your volume is digitized, right? And I think that all the other costs kind of come off and you're able to kind of optimize your organization around that. So if you can get to 90+% like the organizations we talked about, you're definitely a leader in this industry. If you're doing things like looking at more collaborative approaches like vendor managed inventory, forecast collaboration, sharing information, giving visibility back to your suppliers too, you're definitely going to be a leader in this. If you're looking at how do I incorporate those logistics signals, how do I optimize my working capital? You're not just thinking about administrative savings. I say 10 minutes. You're thinking about, I want to use this to really optimize my supply chain. You're a leader, but these are, this is a moving target, so to speak, right? We talk about 90+%, or I talk about 90+%, potentially driving all of these other things that you're able to kind of move to that next level of supply chain technology. But I really think, with some of the technology we talked about today, like the quick link email solution, that 90%, I don't know that we're ever going to get to 100%, but I think that in the next 5 years or so, 99% is going to be really achievable. And that's where companies that are going to be on the leading edge are going to be at, is around 99% of their supply chain being digitized.
Well, I think that's a great question or great metric to focus on, because like you said, I think that question in terms of what percent of your network is digitally connected, has a ripple effect on everything else that we've talked about here. So the higher the number, the more ahead of the curve you are. So I think that's a great opening question for anyone listening today to maybe ask yourselves at your next meeting, your next team meeting, is to get a handle on that and see where you guys are. Well, Omar, like I always say at the end of all our episodes, we always just manage to scratch the surface on these topics, and a lot of food for thought. A lot of things, moving parts to this whole process. But I think you provided some great insights and advice. So thank you for making the time to be with us today.
My pleasure, Adrian. Thank you for having me.
I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the Elemica website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Omar, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.